There's a field of psychology called developmental psychology. And as you can probably guess, developmental psych studies the human life cycle, going from an infant into childhood, adolescence, adulthood, and finally old age. So it looks at each of those time frames in the human lifespan, and it studies the human motivations involved and how thinking changes and how we interact with those around us and how all of this kind of shifts and reprioritizes itself over time. So this aspect of the lifespan and the stages of development is an important part of developmental psych, but a lot of people who are in the field focus on kids. And oftentimes developmental psychology is closely connected with childhood psychology. One of the reasons that psychologists look at kids in order to get insight into human nature is potentially because they haven't been burdened down by all of the things that weigh down adults. Kids haven't been absorbed into the culture enough to care about things like money and power and sex and status. So there are some people out there who think that early childhood might be the last blank slate left for humanity. In this interconnected world where everybody knows everything immediately, information is transmitted instantly, and our social lives are available for everybody to see at all moments, a developmental psychologist might say that studying childhood behavior and thought processes, even though obviously a kid isn't fully developed yet, this might give us some insight into what it means to be human. I think it's an interesting idea to think about, but I don't think it's the last blank slate left to humanity, as some developmental psychologists might say. I think certainly that studying history gives us access into the realm of human nature, even if our analysis and our study of that history might be clouded by the culture that we live in and the desires that we have and the biases that we're all prone to, etc. And I also think there's a similar story of getting access to what it might mean to be a human at the most basic level in stories and in narratives. Fantasy, fiction, science fiction, speculative fiction. And I think it's interesting to think about this idea with the road. I think Cormac McCarthy has imagined a world almost like a totally corrupted blank slate. What information or knowledge or feeling could be gleaned about human nature if we imagined the worst possible world? What if we stripped away all of the things that humans are totally absorbed by in the modern day, and we imagined a world where suddenly none of that mattered at all? Sure, it's a fictional idea and it's a fictional world, although it may not be that fictional at some point in the future, which we'll get to in the next episode. But just by thinking about these types of questions, what would all of a sudden matter a lot more? What doesn't matter anymore? What would we now pay more attention to if we lived in this world? I think that in The Road, Cormac McCarthy asks these questions of the reader on purpose. He wants you to stare evil and bleakness and death right in the face and think about what matters to you now all of a sudden. If you could wipe everything away and live in this corrupted blank slate, what would matter all of a sudden? What would be the things that drive you to keep going on? Would you even have that drive? Who would you want to be spending your time with? Why? These questions unfold in your mind as you're reading The Road, and they're also things that the man and the boy in the story have to contend with. So we left off the last episode pretty early on in the book. The man and the boy are on the road. They're on this journey south to the coast, looking, hoping for some sort of goodness to come their way. along the way, we are getting our first taste of the wretchedness of the world and how things have gone horribly wrong. There's one moment where the man has to climb over a storage truck of some sort, and he comes across, quote, that sour smell he'd come to know, end quote. Of course, it turns out to be human bodies decaying and trapped in this trailer. This is kind of our first glimpse of what we're going to be getting a lot of in the road, which is really the end of humanity. They encounter their first living person shortly after this. There's a man who has been struck by lightning, and he just has this horrifying look and walk about him. You might say he looks like something out of a horror movie, but a statement like that wouldn't even have any meaning inside of the universe of this book. The kid wants to stop and help this guy who's been struck by lightning. The man obviously is protective of the kid and wants to keep going towards their destination, which ultimately they do. But we get this first glimpse of the kid as someone who seems to be just naturally good. He's generous. He wants to help when he can. He feels compassion for other people around him, even though he probably shouldn't. And the man has this conflicted aspect of his relationship with the boy in this respect, because he wants to foster that goodness and show the boy hope and goodness. But he also understands that in this world that they live in, sometimes if you show some goodness or if you show some compassion, you're going to get taken advantage of very quickly and you're going to find yourselves dead. So the man is struggling with this idea of goodness in the world and how much to shield his son from some of the evil in the world that he knows about and that he's experienced and that he's living in. And he's also struggling with some of those existential questions that we were throwing around at the beginning of the podcast. He's wondering about meaning and purpose. He's wondering what matters now. And he's also having memories where he's looking back into the past and looking at the things that used to matter to him and wondering about how those things have changed. At one point early on in the journey, they come across the man's old childhood house and he does some reminiscing. There's a great passage. McCarthy says, quote, "The boy held on to his hand, all much as he'd remembered it. The room's empty. In the small room off the dining room, there was a bare iron cot, a metal folding table. The same cast iron coal grate in the small fireplace. The pine paneling was gone from the walls, leaving just the furring strips. He stood there. He felt with his thumb in the painted wood of the mantel the pinholes from tacks that had held stockings 40 years ago. This is where we used to have Christmas when I was a boy." He turned and looked out at the waste of the yard, a tangle of dead lilac. The shape of a hedge. On cold winter nights when the electricity was out in a storm, we would sit at the fire here, me and my sisters, doing our homework. The boy watched him, watched shapes claiming him he could not see. "We should go, Papa," he said. "Yes," the man said, but he didn't. End quote. Remember that they're now living in a world that's been totally decimated. There is nothing but ash and soot and gray skies and clouds and rain and cold. And the man has this moment in his old house where he's feeling the structure, imagining what used to be, remembering Christmas. It reminds me a little bit of some of the letters that the soldiers in the trenches during World War I would write home to their families. There they were at the end of the world, and at times you would get a letter similar to this passage, a vibrant and colorful dream in the midst of the reality of bleakness and death. At one point, the man says that, quote, "Dreams are the worlds that might be, but never the one to be," end quote. This idea that dreams are so close to being reality, but they never will be reality, contributes to the somber tone of the novel. The other thing that the man spends a lot of time remembering and reminiscing on is his wife and the mother of the boy. It's revealed that after the fall of the world, the wife falls into a pretty deep depression and she kills herself rather than continuing to live in this horrifying world. She couldn't find a way to cope or deal with the hopelessness of the situation. And she argues that, in fact, she's not even killing herself because death is already here. They're living in it. The world has become death, or maybe the world already was death, and now it's just revealing itself. So obviously there's some pretty brutal passages where the man is remembering his wife, and there's one passage in particular that really stands out even in all of these little small interludes throughout the book where he's remembering his wife. But he's sitting on the beach and he's remembering a time from earlier in his life. And McCarthy says, quote, "He remembered waking once on such a night to the clatter of crabs in the pan where he'd left steak bones from the night before, faint deep coals of the driftwood fire pulsing in the onshore wind, lying under such a myriad of stars, the sea's black horizon. He rose and walked out and stood barefoot in the sand and watched the pale surf appear all down the shore and roll and crash and darken again. When he went back to the fire, he knelt and smoothed her hair as she slept, and he said if he were God, he would have made the world just so, and no different." End quote. Throughout the book, there are these little moments, these little memories, oftentimes of simple and ordinary things that keep popping up over and over for the man. And remember, we know from earlier in the book that he's dying and he doesn't have long to go. And so these memories serve as an important guidepost for the man and as a byproduct for the boy as well, trying to remember what was lost and to hold on to it. And as we see, the things that he's remembering are now actually the only things that matter anymore. All of the sort of added stuff that clutters the mind and makes life complicated for the modern person living in the real world is gone. And through these memories, we get a window into what actually matters for the man and potentially what should matter for all of us. He's remembering things like family, home, relationships, special moments that had an impact on him. But of course, Cormac McCarthy being Cormac McCarthy, he can't just let the man have these memories. He has to throw out this idea about human memory that might be true, which is that every time you remember something, you do damage to the original. We do know that human memory is fallible. Memories can change over time, they can fade over time, certainly, and they can even disappear. And the way we remember something is not necessarily the way that it exactly happened. McCarthy says, quote, "Rich dreams now which he was loath to wake from, things no longer known in the world. The cold drove him forth to mend the fire. Memory of her crossing the lawn toward the house in the early morning in a thin rose gown that clung to her breasts. He thought each memory recalled must do some violence to its origins, as in a party game. Say the word and pass it on, so be sparing. What you alter in the remembering has yet a reality, known or not." End quote. This quote has some of the philosophizing that is so rampant in a lot of other Cormac McCarthy books, but not as much present in The Road. But I like it here because it's a reminder that it's not just this poignant moment where the man is remembering what he had and what he lost. He also is kind of doing battle with his own mind and his own memory. And our memories are imperfect corruptions of the real event, just a shade. So the man wants to remember her as she was, and sometimes he worries that by overdoing it and by over remembering, so to speak, he's going to do damage to who she really was. So this idea of memory and the past kind of fading from reality fits into the novel and fits into a world where humanity is fading from reality. So as the man and the boy continue their journey on the road, as the man continues to reminisce about the past, and as the boy wonders about the past and what really was, they continue to run into danger. And the first real acute situation where they almost die comes when one of these roving bands of cannibals and killers comes close by. They have an encounter with one of the guys. He's creepily staring at the boy as he's trying to talk his way out of the situation. Eventually, he lunges for the boy. The man finally shoots and kills him. The boy has a little bit of an existential crisis, seeing his dad murder somebody. The boy has these other moments where he sees a dog and really doesn't want to kill and eat the dog, even though you get the sense that the man might want to. He also supposedly runs into what he calls a little boy, and he'll ask the dad from time to time about this boy and if they can find him and keep him. And you wonder, A, does the boy actually exist? And B, is this some sort of way for McCarthy to symbolize innocence and maybe even goodness that is just out of their reach? It's at this point in the story that we get our first mention of the idea of carrying the fire. So the boy is very much concerned with them still being the good guys. And I don't want to get into this too much because I think I'll save it for the next episode. But throughout the book, the boy asked the man if they are carrying the fire, holding on to some goodness and some hope in a world that is totally bereft of those things. And this idea of what does goodness look like at the end of the world comes into play throughout the novel. And it's actually more difficult to come up with and think about because it's so sparse and sparing throughout the book, examples of goodness. On the other hand, it is no trouble at all to identify evil at the end of the world. I'm going to read a passage here of McCarthy describing one of these bands of cannibals that are on the road along with the man and the boy, and they're passing by. Quote, "What is it, Papa? People on the road. Keep your face down. Don't look. No smoke from the dead fire. Nothing to be seen of the cart. He wallowed into the ground and lay watching across his forearm. An army in tennis shoes, tramping, carrying 3-foot lengths of pipe with leather wrappings, lanyards at the wrist. Some of the pipes were threaded through with lengths of chain fitted at their ends with every manner of bludgeon. They clanked past, marching with a swaying gait like wind-up toys. Bearded, their breath smoking through their masks. Shh, he said, shh. The phalanx following carried spears or lances tasseled with ribbons, the long blades hammered out of truck springs in some crude forge up country. The boy lay with his face in his arms, terrified. They passed 200 feet away, the ground shuddering lightly, tramping. Behind them came wagons drawn by slaves in harness and piled with goods of war, and after that the women, perhaps a dozen in number, some of them pregnant, and lastly a supplementary consort of catamites, ill-clothed against the cold and fitted in dog collars, and yoked each to each, all passed on. They lay listening. Are they gone, Papa? Yes, they're gone. Did you see them? Yes. Were they the bad guys? Yes, they were the bad guys. There's a lot of them, those bad guys. Yes, there are, but they're gone. End quote. Horrifyingly scary there. This is evil at the end of the world, the end of civilization, the breakdown of humanity, and it's not a good sign for the man and the boy that they were on the move. Shortly after this, the man and the boy go through another horrifying moment. They reach a big house on a hill, and as they go to investigate the house, they find prisoners in a hatch located under the kitchen. And I'll spare the more gruesome details, but there are basically enslavers who are slowly using these people in order to eat them alive and survive in this horrible world. The man and the boy run away from the slavers, and there's a brief moment where the man contemplates what happens if he's going to get caught. Obviously, he doesn't want to end up being eaten alive slowly, and he's trying to contemplate, do I kill my child myself? Do I tell him to do it himself? Again, just horrifying thoughts here. And I think you can make a strong argument that this is really the low point of the man and the boy's journey in the road. I think I might argue that that low point actually comes later in the book, which I think we'll get to in the next episode. But at any rate, the duo finally come across an apple orchard, and they stumble upon some apples and some water, and eventually they also discover a survival shelter, and it's basically random chance that saves them. They're able to hang out there a few days and recharge. There's this brief moment of normalcy in this crazy journey that they're on, and you might think that's a great thing, and it is, but it actually at times can sting as bad as anything else, because that moment of normalcy is just a reminder again of what was. And in this world, it's impossible to remember what was without also remembering what was lost. McCarthy says, quote, "When he woke again, he thought the rain had stopped, but that wasn't what woke him. He'd been visited in a dream by creatures of a kind he'd never seen before. They did not speak. He thought that they'd been crouching by the side of his cot as he slept, and then had skulked away on his awakening. He turned and looked at the boy. Maybe he understood for the first time that to the boy, he was himself an alien, a being from a planet that no longer existed, the tales of which were suspect. He could not construct for the child's pleasure the world he lost without constructing the loss as well, and he thought perhaps the child had known this better than he. He tried to remember the dream, but he could not. All that was left was the feeling of it. He thought perhaps they'd come to warn him. Of what? That he could not enkindle in the heart of the child what was ashes in his own. Even now, some part of him wished they'd never found this refuge. Some part of him always wished it to be over." End quote. Eventually, they leave the survival shelter, and they're back on the road. And I think I'll leave this episode with a moment that I've always loved, where the man and the boy have no choice in this particular scenario but to sit back to back on the road, each looking a different direction, watching each other's backs, continuing the journey, looking for hope, back to back with all that matters in the corrupted blank slate of humanity.